The price of choosing the rain in New York City. Rain lashed the windshield of Richard Holloway's black S-Class Mercedes as he navigated the congested streets of New York City. His fingers drummed impatiently on the leather steering wheel, his jaw tight with the familiar weight of another chapter 16-hour workday. At 38, Richard had built an empire in the financial sector through relentless focus and calculated decisions. His steel-gray eyes, which had intimidated countless business rivals, now stared blankly at the city's blurred lights through the glass. Richard was a man who commanded attention. 6'3" with broad shoulders that perfectly filled his custom-tailored Italian suits, he possessed the kind of presence that could silence a boardroom with a single glance. His dark hair was always impeccably styled, and his clean-shaven face conveyed the confidence of someone who had never failed. Yet tonight felt different. A restlessness gnawed at him. The traffic light turned red, forcing him to stop in the Upper West Side. Richard reached for his phone, mentally bracing himself for the emails that demanded his attention. That's when he saw her. Through the passenger window, crossing the intersection, was a figure that stopped his heart. Irene Cortez. No longer Irene Holloway, though she'd likely reverted to her maiden name, stood beneath a broken streetlight with scant shelter. Her hair, once golden, now clung to her face from the rain as she clutched something precious to her chest, desperately trying to shield it from the downpour. Richard held his breath. In Irene's arms was a small girl, with dark hair and curious eyes that shone even in the gloom. Eliza, his daughter, though he had never claimed the title. The woman who had once shared his bed, his home, and his last name, looked nothing like the polished socialite she had been during their marriage. Irene's clothes, a thin coat that offered little protection and worn jeans, spoke of struggles he had never bothered to consider. Eliza, now 14 months old, giggled despite the rain, her tiny hands reaching to catch the drops. The sound of that innocent laughter pierced the car's soundproofing and went straight into Richard's chest, creating an ache he hadn't felt since the day he signed the divorce papers. This was the baby he knew, but chose to ignore. The pregnancy he dismissed as bad timing. The birth he missed because of a crucial business meeting that probably didn't matter at all. Without thinking, Richard pulled over to the curb. His hand shook slightly as he killed the engine. The rain soaked his expensive suit the moment he stepped out of the car, but he barely noticed. His Italian leather shoes splashed in puddles as he crossed the street. "Irene?" His voice came out harsher than intended. She turned, her green eyes widening in surprise before quickly hardening with a mix of pain and defiance. Eliza looked at him with innocent curiosity, her small hand gripping her mother's wet coat. "Richard." Irene's voice was steady, but he could hear the underlying tension. "What are you doing here?" He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself speechless. How could he explain that seeing them like this, vulnerable, yet beautiful in their resilience, had shattered something inside him he had carefully locked away? "I saw you," he finally managed, his voice barely audible above the rain. "I couldn't just drive by." Irene shifted Eliza to her other hip, the movement protective and instinctive. "You see us now, after over a year of pretending we don't exist?" The accusation hit him physically because it was true. He had pretended. He had convinced himself that leaving was the responsible thing, that a man like him, ambitious, emotionally unavailable, had no business trying to be a father. "She's wet and cold, and we need to get inside," Irene said dryly. "Let me help," Richard said, reaching for his wallet. "Let me." "We don't need your money, Richard." Irene's interruption was sharp, her pride intact despite her circumstances. "We never did. We needed you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of lost time and failed opportunities. The word daddy. Richard's costly Italian shoes squeaked on the diner's linoleum floor as he followed Irene inside, water dripping from his tailored suit onto the worn tiles. Irene had finally agreed to let him buy them shelter from the rain. Irene settled into a booth near the window, carefully positioning Eliza on her lap. The girl's eyes were wide as she took in her new surroundings. When her gaze landed on Richard, she tilted her head with the innocence only toddlers possess. "Mama," Eliza babbled, pointing a tiny finger at Richard. Richard's chest tightened. He was a stranger to his own daughter, nothing more than a curiosity. "She's walking now," Irene said softly, not looking directly at him. "Started 3 weeks ago. She loves music, especially that one lullaby from the old Disney movies. And she's stubborn. Gets that from both of us, I suppose. What's her favorite food? Strawberries. And those little goldfish crackers." Irene's voice softened as she spoke of Eliza. "Button? Button?" Eliza cried out, her voice rising in distress. "Sweetheart, Button is home. Remember, we'll see him soon." Irene comforted her, but Eliza's lower lip began to tremble, and soon tears welled up. Richard watched helplessly as Irene attempted several distractions. Without thinking, Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his fountain pen. An elegant Mont Blanc that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He clicked it open and closed repeatedly, creating a soft, rhythmic sound that immediately captured Eliza's attention. "Look at this," he said quietly, holding the pen so the diner lights caught its silver surface. Eliza's crying stopped. Slowly, she leaned forward from Irene's lap, extending her tiny hand toward the shiny object. Richard placed the pen on the table. The little girl giggled and grabbed it with both hands, immediately bringing it to her mouth. "No, no, sweetie," Irene said softly, then stopped abruptly, her face flushing as she realized what she had almost said. "We don't eat daddies." The word hung in the air between them. "Daddy." Something fractured in Richard's chest. "It's okay," he said quietly. "She should know who I am, even if I haven't earned the title." Irene looked at him, and Richard saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness. It was too soon for that. But perhaps the start of recognition that the man sitting across from her was different from the one who had left. "She likes you," Irene observed, though her tone remained cautious. "I don't deserve it," Richard replied honestly, "but I'm grateful for it." "Irene," Richard started, his voice thick with emotion. "I need you to know." "No." She held up a hand, her eyes still fixed on Eliza. "Not tonight. Tonight. Just let her get used to you being here." Richard nodded, understanding that this fragile moment was more than he deserved. For the first time in over a year, Richard felt he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. Richard's choice. 3 days after the encounter, Richard found himself doing something he never did. Sitting in his office, staring at his phone instead of his screens. He had canceled a crucial meeting that he'd been working on for 8 months. 20 minutes later, Richard was standing outside a modest house in Westchester County, a quiet area outside the city. He had found Irene's address through methods he wasn't proud of, hiring a private investigator. "Richard, how did you—" "I hired someone to find you," he admitted, knowing that starting with honesty was his only chance. "I know how that sounds, but I needed to see her again, see both of you." "You can't just show up here unannounced," Irene said. "You're right. I should have called first. I should have done a lot of things differently." "Is she here?" In reply, children's music drifted from inside, followed by Eliza's squeals of delight. "She's having lunch," Irene said. "And before you ask, no, you can't come in. Not like this. Not unannounced." "Then let me ask you something else. When can I see her again? Properly this time. When you're comfortable." "Why now, Richard? You had 16 months to care about her existence. What changed?" "Teet. Seeing you two in the rain broke something in me I didn't even know was broken," he said, facing the truth. "I spent so long convincing myself I wasn't father material, that I would only mess her up like my own father messed me up." "Your father?" Irene's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing some of the hostility. "He was never around, always working, always building the empire I eventually inherited. When he was home, he was critical, distant. I told myself I was protecting Eliza by staying away, but really, I was only protecting myself." Eliza appeared in this doorway, peering around Irene's legs. She was wearing a yellow dress with tiny daisies. When she saw Richard, her face lit up with a huge smile. "Penman?" she exclaimed. "Hello, Eliza." Richard's throat closed with emotion. "What would it take for you to trust me enough to let me try?" Richard asked Irene. "I just want a chance to be present for her, in a way I never was before. There's a playground 6 blocks from here, Central Park. Saturday mornings. We go there for an hour around 10. If you want to see her, you can meet us there. But I set the rules, Richard. Any sign that this is just a guilt phase you're going through, and you're out of our lives for good." "Saturday at 10. Richard nodded eagerly. "I'll be there. A home, not an empire." Saturday morning arrived with crisp air and golden light. Richard had been awake since 5 a.m., changing clothes 3 times to try and look approachable. He had never been nervous before a meeting, but standing at the park entrance at 9:45, he felt like a teenager on a first date. They sat on a bench with a clear view of the playground and watched with fascination as Eliza immediately made friends with another child. "I brought something," Richard said suddenly, pulling out a small, wrapped package. "It's not about the gifts, Richard. It's not expensive," he cut in. "Just something I thought she'd like." The package contained a small board book titled Ellie's First Words, with a friendly cartoon elephant on the cover. "Would you read to her?" Irene asked. Eliza eagerly scooted over to Richard. He opened the book carefully. Once upon a time, there was a little elephant named Ellie who loved learning new words. When they reached a page showing Ellie playing with her family, Eliza looked up at Richard with wide eyes. "Daddy Elephant," she said naturally, pointing to the male elephant in the picture. "That's right," Richard managed, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the daddy elephant. Don't leave," Irene said quietly. "Don't make promises you can't keep." "I'm not going anywhere, Irene. I know I have no right to ask you to believe me, but I need you to know that everything is different now." "What's different? Your priorities?" Irene asked, her words laced with justice. "Your total inability to put anyone else's needs before your own? I've been thinking about what you said, that you needed me, not my money. I think I finally understand what that means." The final confrontation. On Tuesday night, Richard's private line rang at his penthouse. It was Irene. "Richard, I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't know who else to call. Eliza has been sick with a high fever for 2 days, and it's not breaking. I'm at the ER at New York Presbyterian Hospital. I'm scared. I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, Richard burst through the emergency doors. Eliza lay inert in the small hospital bed. The sight of his daughter so still and pale hit him physically. "Have you slept?" Richard asked Irene. "I can't, not while she's like this." Without a word, Richard made a quick call. In minutes, a nurse appeared with coffee and a comfortable chair Richard had arranged. "You have to take care of yourself, too," he said softly, guiding Irene into the chair. "She needs you strong." Around midnight, the doctor came in with the test results. The good news was that Eliza only had a severe ear infection. "I was so scared," Irene admitted, her voice barely a whisper of relief. "When they mentioned meningitis, I kept thinking of all the things I'd never taught her. And I realized that even though I'm angry at you, I wanted her to know her father." "I love her," Richard said quietly. "I think I loved her from the moment I saw her in your arms that night in the rain. I was just too afraid, and too selfish to admit it." At 2 a.m., Eliza's fever finally began to break. She slowly opened her eyes and gave Richard a weak but genuine smile. "Penman," she whispered, her voice husky. "Hi, sweetie. How are you feeling?" Eliza extended her small hand toward him. When Richard took her tiny fingers, she squeezed with surprising strength. "Daddy and I aren't going anywhere," Richard reassured her. The legacy of fear. 3 weeks later, Richard had established an unthinkable routine, working from home on Fridays, with a small children's corner set up in his office. On a November afternoon, his private line rang. Caller ID showed his father's name. Robert Holloway, a man who hadn't called his son in over 2 years. "We need to talk," Robert said, his voice authoritative. "I'm in New York, and I'm on my way." Minutes later, Robert Holloway strode in like a storm cloud in an expensive suit. His gaze landed on the children's corner with obvious disdain. "What is that monstrosity doing in your office?" Robert demanded. "That child is your granddaughter," Richard said, his voice dangerously low. "A child you rightly walked away from. A child who represents nothing but a hindrance to this family's legacy." "Enough," Richard's control snapped. "You will not talk about Irene or Eliza like that. They are my family." Eliza silently slid off Richard's lap and walked over to Robert. "Hi," she said cheerfully, holding up her elephant book. "Do you want to read about Ellie?" "I don't read children's books," Robert said scornfully. Richard watched his daughter's face fall at the harsh rejection, and something inside him completely broke. This was exactly what his own childhood had been. Cold, critical, and loveless. "Get out," Richard said quietly. "You're fired from my life. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. That woman and that child will ruin you." "Mom didn't ruin you," Richard retorted calmly. "You ruined yourself by choosing money over love. I won't make the same mistake." The confession and the forgiveness following his father's expulsion, Richard was suspended from his role as CEO. He found himself without a company, without corporate credit cards, but with Eliza in his arms. "I made my choice," Richard told Irene. "And now what have you lost, Richard?" Irene asked. "Money. I have enough to live comfortably several lifetimes over. Status? I never cared about impressing strangers. Power? The only power that matters to me now is the power to be present for my daughter." Eliza looked up at him with her bright eyes. "Daddy," she said clearly. "Yes, sweetheart," Richard whispered, kissing her head. "I'm your daddy." Days later, Richard faced a court hearing regarding his mental competency, instigated by his father. Just before the judge delivered his ruling, Robert threw one last bombshell, revealing that Irene had visited him at his office 3 weeks earlier. "She wanted to make a deal," Robert said with a cruel smile. "She said she would disappear with the child if I paid her $5 million. Richard felt betrayed again, but he turned directly to Irene. "You went to see him?" "Yes, I went to see your father," Irene confessed, tears in her eyes. "But not for the reasons you think. I was terrified you would regret losing your inheritance. I went to try and buy you space to go back to the company, pledging to waive any support or visitation if he just gave you time. He assumed I wanted the money and offered it. I told him he could keep his money and go to hell." Richard felt his anger melt away. "You should have told me. I was ashamed that I had doubted your choice. I was trying to protect you from having to choose again." "Irene," Richard said softly, "we can't keep making decisions for each other out of fear. If we're going to be a family, we have to trust each other with the truth." Eliza snuggled close, hugging both of them. "I want Mommy. I want Daddy." "Now we figure it out together," Richard said. "My career, our relationship, how to give Eliza the life she deserves. We do it honestly as partners." 2 years later, 8 years later, the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of their cozy home in Westchester County. Eliza, 3 years old, was building a castle. "Daddy, look," Eliza announced. Richard closed his laptop. His consulting firm, Ascend Strategic Consulting, was steadily growing, and his classes at Columbia Business School were full. Irene appeared with their 6-month-old son, James. Richard took his son, amazed at how natural fatherhood had become. He had remarried Irene in a simple ceremony in their backyard. "Daddy, blocks play?" "Sure, princess." "Richard, do you ever regret everything you gave up to have this?" Richard looked at his wife and children. "Irene, I didn't give up anything. I finally discovered what was worth keeping." As Eliza and James played, Richard knew that true wealth was what grew when shared, multiplied when given away, and could never be taken. He had found peace. The first step, meeting the grandfather. The tension in the yard. 6 weeks had passed since Robert Holloway's call and his tentative offer of amends. After tense discussions with his lawyer Sophia and between themselves, Richard and Irene agreed to a brief meeting. Not in his cold penthouse, but in the quiet yard of their new home in Westchester County, on Richard's turf. Irene sat on a porch bench, cradling James, who was fast asleep. Richard was beside her, his face tense as he sipped coffee. "I've made things very clear," Richard whispered, his voice low and firm. "If he says one negative word about you, about me, or about anything we've built, the meeting ends instantly." "I know, Richard," Irene responded, giving him a reassuring look. "But don't forget he's also a father. Maybe he just doesn't know how to be one." Richard snorted. He only knows how to exert dominance. Robert's silver Audi parked outside the gate. He walked into the yard, without bodyguards or assistants, alone. Robert Holloway, the once untouchable financial magnate, looked smaller, slightly disoriented. He wore a poorly fitting sports jacket, a clumsy attempt to appear less formal. His gaze swept the yard, paused at the wooden swing set, and fixed on Irene and Richard. "Richard!" Robert's voice was gravelly and rough. "Father!" Richard stepped forward, maintaining a respectful but firm distance. "Where is the girl?" Robert asked immediately, his eyes searching for her. "Eliza is playing with Sophia inside," Irene replied, standing up. She placed James in the bassinet and looked directly at Robert. "You have 15 minutes, Robert." "The first conversation." Robert nodded, his rigid formality giving way to a strange anxiety. He stared intently at the yard, not daring to look directly at Irene or Richard. "First, Irene," he began, his voice trembling slightly, something Richard had never heard. "I'm sorry. I treated you badly. I called you a gold digger. It was wrong. Richard told me you came to see me for him, that you refused the money, that you did it to save him from the choice I forced him to make. I don't know what to say." Irene gripped her hands. She couldn't forgive so easily, but she sensed the sincerity of the regret. "I don't need your apology for me, Robert. I need you to respect your son's life." "I will," Robert replied, a hint of weakness in his voice. "Richard won. He showed me he has something I never did, the courage to change. I lost everything, not the money, but the power. I want to know what it feels like to be a grandfather." "You won't be a grandfather in the same way you were a father," Richard intervened, his voice firm. "No criticism, no judgment, no manipulation." "I understand," Robert responded, nodding slightly. "The elephant story." As if on cue, Eliza came running out. She saw the strange, gray-haired man next to her parents. "Daddy, who is it?" Eliza asked, clinging to Richard's legs. "This is your grandfather, Robert, Eliza," Richard replied gently. "He came to meet you." Eliza looked up, her bright gray eyes staring intently at her grandfather. Robert bent down, a clumsy, stiff gesture. He didn't know what to do with a child. His hands, accustomed to grasping memos, trembled. "Hello, Eliza," Robert stammered. I brought you a gift." He pulled out a small blue box. Eliza stared at it. "I don't want it, Daddy." "It's okay, sweetie," Richard said, rubbing his daughter's back. Irene stepped closer. "I think she'd like it better if you told her a story." "Tell a story?" Robert frowned. "Yes. About an elephant." Irene walked into the house and Richard understood. She wanted him to tell the story Richard had invented about the brave elephant, Eliza's favorite. Robert looked at Richard, a look of panic in his eyes. Richard shrugged, leaving him to his fate. Robert cleared his throat, trying to recall the story Richard had once told him over the phone. "Once upon a time, there was a little elephant named Ellie," Robert began, his voice as stiff as if reading a financial report. But seeing Eliza's focused eyes, his tone softened. "This elephant lived at the zoo. It was very safe, but it felt lonely. It was afraid of the outside world. But then it remembered it had a family out there. So it decided to go find them." As he continued, describing the elephant's hesitation and fear of leaving its safe place, Robert's voice became more resonant. He was not just telling Eliza's story, but his own. A man who had lived in the zoo of power and was finally seeking connection. When Robert finished, Eliza clapped. "I like the brave elephant." She walked over, her small arms wrapping around her grandfather's leg. Robert froze. He hadn't hugged anyone in decades, let alone a child. He awkwardly bent down and placed a trembling hand on Eliza's hair. "You are a brave elephant," he said, an unusual emotion in his voice. Richard and Irene exchanged a look. 15 minutes had passed, but this meeting wouldn't end anytime soon. It was a beginning, built on truth, courage, and a story about a brave elephant. The clumsiness of the gift. A new protocol, Robert Holloway's visits became a bi-weekly event, always agreed upon in advance, and strictly 1 hour long, supervised by Richard or Irene. Richard called it the grandfather protocol, and enforced it with the same precision he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. Robert's biggest problem was money. He had spent his entire life solving problems with financial resources, and he didn't know how to interact with Eliza without the intention of buying her. One December afternoon, Robert arrived at the yard with a package that, by its size and wrapping label, clearly contained the most expensive Victorian dollhouse on the market. "Grandpa Robert," Eliza said, with a 3-year-old's curiosity, but without the effusiveness her father or Aunt Sophia provoked. "Look what Grandpa brought," Robert said, breathless from carrying the heavy box. "It's a house for your dolls, with tiny lights and furniture." Eliza looked at the huge box, then looked at Richard. "It's very big," Eliza murmured. "Where do I put Button?" "Button can live in the attic, sweetheart," Irene said, trying to smooth over the situation. Robert's face twitched slightly. "You don't like it, Eliza. It's a historical replica. It's handmade." "She likes it, Robert," Richard intervened calmly, noticing his father's disappointment. "But Eliza is in a building phase. Right now she prefers to build her own castles." To prove it, Eliza dragged her grandfather to the corner of the living room and showed him the elephant castle she had built with blankets and pillows. "Can you help me put up the flag?" Eliza asked. Robert, the man who had managed the IPO of the decade, spent the next 20 minutes clumsily securing a piece of cloth with a safety pin, visibly frustrated by the lack of logic and instability of the structure. The lesson of humility. When he left, the massive dollhouse remained on the porch. Richard followed his father to the car. "We need to talk about this," Richard said. "About what, Richard?" Robert was exasperated. "That I've lost the ability to choose a gift? I spend more on a business lunch than that toy. What do you want me to do? I want you to stop spending your money and start spending your time, Father. And your attention," Richard said, his voice firm but gentle. "Eliza doesn't need a museum replica. She needs to know that she loves the color yellow and that she likes you to read to her. She's not trying to impress you with her IQ, so stop trying to impress her with your bank account." "But how do I do that? I don't know anything about that world." "I know," Richard said. "But you're a man of planning and logic, aren't you? Apply that." Richard reminded him how, years ago, Robert had spent 3 months researching the Tokyo real estate market just to ensure his investment was safe. Put that same energy into learning about Eliza. Otherwise, no matter how much money we have left, you will never know your granddaughter. A week later, Robert returned without a gift, but with a leather folder under his arm. He found Eliza in the dining room, drawing. "Hello, Eliza," Robert said. "I didn't bring you a gift, but I brought a plan." Eliza put down her crayon, intrigued. Robert opened the folder and pulled out a meticulously drawn blueprint. "Your father told me you like to build things. This structure is called the Impenetrable Fortress." The magnate pointed to a diagram of what looked like a wooden playhouse, robust and bolted to the ground. "I have calculated the wind load and the foundation stability. If we use the posts I have in the office warehouse and order plywood boards, I can guarantee that this castle will not fall down." Eliza looked at the blueprints with wide eyes. She didn't understand anything about stability, but she understood the word castle. "Can you build a real castle?" "I can build the safest castle in Westchester County," Robert said, the gleam of corporate determination returning to his eyes. For the first time in months, he was back in his element. But this time, his logic was at the service of love. He spent the next 2 hours in the yard with a tape measure and Eliza, talking about angles, durability, and where the windows should go, so the elephant could see the strawberries. As Irene watched the scene from the window, holding James, she felt the knot in her stomach loosen. Robert would never be soft, but he was using the only language he knew, planning and construction, to express his affection. "Looks like your grandfather protocol is working," Irene whispered to Richard, who was standing next to her, watching with a smile. "It works because for the first time in his life, my father is investing in something he can't sell," Richard replied. "He's building a real legacy. The impenetrable fortress, the contractor, and the CEO." 2 weekends later, the yard in Westchester County ceased to be a quiet green space and became a high-precision construction site. Robert Holloway arrived at 8 a.m. sharp in a rental van, complete with a professional tool belt, work boots, and a set of revised blueprints with marginal efficiency notes. Richard was waiting for him with coffee. "Father, you didn't have to rent a table saw. We could have used—" "Time is money, Richard," Robert interrupted, using the old corporate cliché, but with a surprisingly cheerful tone. "And in this case, time is childhood. We're not going to waste Eliza's mornings with inefficient tools. Besides, I've calculated the material delivery route to minimize noise during James's nap." Richard had to admit that while his father had retired from business, the magnate's logistical planning ability was still impeccable. Robert unfolded the blueprints. "I need 2 teams. Team Alpha handles securing the support posts and framing. That will be me, Eliza, and Richard. Team Beta handles finishing, sanding, and painting. That will be you, Irene." Irene blinked. "Me?" "Yes. Your skills are essential. According to my research, yellow paint requires uniform application to withstand the elements. It's detail work that requires patience and precision, skills I always admired in you when you organized the foundation galas. Plus, Eliza trusts your aesthetic decisions." Irene smiled, feeling recognized not for her money, but for her true abilities. It was the best compliment Robert had ever given her. Planning and yellow. The weekend unfolded with a strange but effective harmony. Richard found himself holding beams and learning how to use a spirit level under his father's watchful and often impatient eye. The frustration was evident, but for the first time, it wasn't professional frustration, but simple building frustration. "Damn it, Richard, you have a steady hand for moving billions. Why can't you hold that beam straight?" Robert grumbled. But instead of retreating in anger, Richard smiled. It was a father-son scolding over a shared task, not a judgment on his worth. Meanwhile, Eliza was the foreman. She supervised the sanding and ensured that every inch of wood her grandfather cut was perfectly smooth. Her main task, however, was to make sure the team didn't forget the color. "More yellow, Grandpa Robert," she demanded. Robert had conceded to Eliza's aesthetic demand, buying the brightest, sunniest yellow he could find. A key moment occurred on Saturday afternoon. Robert was screwing the frame of the fortress's small window when Eliza approached with a strawberry in her hand. "Grandpa, why did you make this hole so small?" "Because if it's too big, the wind will get in and damage the structure, Eliza. It's designed for maximum security. But I can't see the strawberries through here. This is the strawberry viewing point." Robert paused. He looked at the small square frame, then at the strawberry, and finally, into Eliza's eyes. "I see," he murmured, the logic of his world collapsing before his granddaughter's simple need. The structure must adapt to the user's requirements. Without hesitation, he unscrewed the lower half of the frame and cut it off, creating a low opening perfect for a 3-year-old to peer out and look at her garden. It was a simple act of engineering, but a gigantic emotional leap for the man. For the first time, he prioritized joy over efficiency. The legacy built by Sunday evening, the impenetrable fortress was complete. It was sturdy, safe, and painted a yellow so intense it glowed in the late Westchester sun. It had a makeshift flag, sewn by Irene, an extra low entrance for Eliza, and an adjacent mommy rest platform designed by Richard. Eliza immediately moved in, bringing Button and all her elephant friends to her new home. Robert took off his tool belt. Exhausted and covered in yellow sawdust, he sat down on the rest platform next to Irene and Richard. "It's stable," Robert said, looking at the castle with a mix of technical pride and unexpressed emotion. "It's perfect, Father," Richard said, patting him on the shoulder. "You didn't build it with money, Robert," Irene said softly. "You built it with your time, with your logic, with your attention. And that's what Eliza will remember." Robert fell silent, watching Eliza peer out the low window and make the gesture of viewing the strawberries. Finally, the pain and guilt he had carried for years felt replaced by the comforting weight of well-cut lumber. His true legacy was not in the skyscrapers of New York, but in the yellow castle in Westchester. "Tu yet voi, chúng ta sẽ tiếp tục câu chuyện với việc Richard đối mặt với một vấn đề đạo đức trong vai trò giáo sư tại Columbia Business School, CBS. Richard's ethical dilemma at Columbia Business School. The practical case study. 2 years into his tenure as an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School, CB. Richard Holloway found a new kind of satisfaction. He wasn't just teaching. He was shaping the next generation of financial leaders, emphasizing ethical leadership, a sharp contrast to the cutthroat world he'd left behind. One afternoon, in his advanced corporate strategy class, Richard assigned a complex case study involving a hostile takeover bid. The objective was to analyze the acquisition's financial logic. The top submission came from Ethan Vance, a brilliant but intensely ambitious student, the kind of relentless, cold genius Richard himself had once been. Ethan's analysis was technically flawless, detailing a structure that would maximize shareholder value by eliminating unnecessary liabilities. However, Richard noticed a subtle but disturbing detail in Ethan's proposed strategy. It relied on the target company's failure to disclose a small, technically legal environmental breach during the due diligence process. Exploiting this breach later would allow the acquiring company to unilaterally terminate the pension fund of thousands of long-term employees under a little-known clause in the merger agreement. It was a perfectly legal, brutal maneuver that would save the acquiring firm millions. Richard knew the move was financially sound, but morally bankrupt. The confrontation. The next day, Richard called Ethan into his office. Ethan, poised and confident, expected praise. "Ethan, your technical analysis is top tier," Richard began, leaning back in his chair. "But let's discuss your liability termination strategy on point." Ethan's confidence didn't waver. "Professor Holloway, it's the most efficient way to maximize the acquisition price. It's a legal loophole that protects the buyer's interests. That's just smart business, right?" The term smart business stung Richard. It was the same justification he'd used to rationalize his own distant behavior years ago. Is it smart business to save a few million by plunging thousands of retirees into financial uncertainty? Richard challenged, his voice dangerously calm. "These are people's lives, their security." "With respect, Professor," Ethan countered, "my job as an executive isn't to be a social worker. It's to generate returns for investors. If the board demands a 20% return, and this move gets us there, it's the fiduciary duty." Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the CBS campus. "I've been where you are, Ethan. I ran an empire on the principle of maximizing gain, and it cost me my first marriage, alienated my father, and almost cost me my daughter. That's the real cost of that smart business." He turned back, his steel-gray eyes locking onto the young man. "The ethics of a decision are not defined by its legality. They're defined by the human consequence. You're asking me to grade a strategy that prioritizes greed over decency. The lesson and the decision." Richard gave Ethan an ultimatum. Rewrite the strategy, eliminating the pension fund maneuver and proposing a plan that treats the legacy employees fairly, or fail the course. Ethan was furious. He argued that CB was a training ground for real business, and Richard was forcing him to adopt a soft strategy that would be laughed out of a Wall Street boardroom. He threatened to go to the dean's office, claiming academic bias against aggressive finance. Richard accepted the challenge. He realized that the test wasn't just for Ethan, it was for him. Could he stand by the principles he now preached, even if it meant jeopardizing his new career? He went to the dean, outlining the case study, and Ethan's response. The dean, having followed Richard's redemptive story in the press, listened intently. When Ethan eventually presented his case to the dean, he was met not with sympathy, but with a quiet challenge. Mr. Vance, if your strategy is legal, then it is your right. But at Columbia, we aim to teach leaders who choose to do what's right when they could do what's merely legal. Professor Holloway is teaching the price of that choice. Ethan, facing the prospect of being flagged by the dean's office and having his reputation tainted before he even started, backed down. He eventually submitted a revised case study. The returns were slightly lower, but the company absorbed the pension fund. A transition plan, Richard gave him a barely passing grade, not for the financial analysis, but for the courage to choose the harder, more ethical path. Later that night, talking to Irene on the phone, as Eliza and James slept, Richard reflected on the day. I almost allowed him to make the same mistake I did, Richard confessed. I chose the illusion of stability and power, and I justified it with smart business. It took losing everything to see that true leadership isn't about how much you can take, but how much you choose to protect. Irene's voice was soft but firm. You didn't just teach a finance lesson today, Richard. You built a bridge between the man you were and the man you are, and that's a bridge that will last. Finale, the value of the choice. Richard Holloway's journey from aloof financier to family man, devoted professor, and relationship healer is complete. A new life in Westchester County, after Richard defends his ethics at Columbia Business School and overcomes his father's coercion. The Holloway family's life in Westchester County settles into a genuine harmony. Richard, now Professor Richard Holloway, is respected not only for his financial knowledge, but also for his integrity. He continues to teach at CBS using his personal experiences, including confronting his father and challenging his student Ethan Vance, as practical lessons, emphasizing that legality does not equate to morality. His consulting firm, Ascend Strategic Consulting, focuses on helping companies balance profit and social responsibility, turning away clients who used the asset-stripping strategies he once pursued. Irene has regained her independence and purpose. She started a small nonprofit using her event planning experience and her network, including unexpected help from Sophia, Richard's former lawyer, to help single mothers start businesses after divorce. She has turned her trauma into motivation, helping other women find self-worth and financial stability without relying on their ex's reparation money. The real legacy. Grandpa Robert Eliza's relationship with her grandfather Robert Holloway continues to thrive thanks to the grandfather protocol. Robert never completely lost his rigidity, but he learned to show affection through actions. Robert spent his weekends tutoring math for poor local high school students, a job he did quietly because Eliza had taught him that the most important things can't be bought with money. He often brought detailed engineering drawings of impromptu construction projects instead of expensive toys. Once, when Robert was installing a new swing in the yard, 5-year-old Eliza ran up and hugged his leg. "Thank you for building wonderful things, Robert," Eliza said. "My uncle isn't about wonderful things, Princess," Robert said, calling Eliza by that affectionate nickname for the first time. "My uncle is about safe things. The most wonderful thing I ever built is your yellow castle and this family. I didn't build it with money. I built it with time. Richard watched from afar, holding James in his arms. He no longer had anything to prove to his father. He had built a legacy that far exceeded any financial empire. A family built on trust, presence, and ethical choices. He had traded his CEO status and inheritance for a swing, stories about Ellie the brave elephant, and unexpected hugs from his daughter. It was a high price, but it was also the best choice he had ever made.